Good afternoon, it's Tuesday the 7th of August 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish. We're delighted to be joined by Mark Anderson, Truthhound. Well, I think we need to get straight into the update on the trial of child abuse whistleblower Melanie Shaw. Melanie Shaw was the very brave lady who started to speak out several years ago about abuse of children at Beechwood Children's Home in Nottingham. And since she took that brave step, her life has been turned upside down. So she spent several periods in prison. In the first period in Peterborough prison, she had a severe leg ulcer which simply went untreated. In fact, she was given dishcloths to use as bandages. She subsequently has gone to a number of other prisons where more recently she has spent over 18 months in solitary confinement. But having finished a 2-year prison term, most of which was in a cell on her own, Melanie was due to appear in Leeds Crown Court at 10:30 this morning. Now, we've been receiving information from a number of people which we're taking on face value as to what was going on. We'll just bring you through this one a minute. I wanted to put in this little sub-headline here, the lie of British justice, because it seems more and more apparent that the British state is desperate that this lady will not get the sort of access to justice that others might. I'll explain a little bit of that in a moment. But the hearing was actually recorded, so this is the listing from Leeds Crown Court. But we understand that Melanie did not appear in court immediately. There appeared to have been some delay, but we understand that she is there now and she has her own barrister with her. Now, Leeds Crown Court, if our viewers are not aware, is a new but very austere building. To me, this is like something out of the Gulag. So the innocent go to court to go through a trial process. This is for the benefit of the public, but it looks like a prison itself, which of course, Mike, is what's happening to most of the court buildings, if you can even get inside them. Public being denied access to many courts in UK. Well, what's the update on Melanie? This is what we think the picture is, but of course, we're only receiving this from individuals and we can't verify all of the sources. So initially she was not in court, but it now appears that she has made it to court and has her barrister with her. It's significant, the business, as to whether or not she's in court, because Melanie has appeared by video link on several previous occasions, and during those video link hearings, the video link has failed on one occasion, just at the point where she was putting forward her own defence. Now, we understand the sexual assault charge has been dropped. This was a charge for a crime supposedly committed inside Style or one of the other prisons. But she apparently still faces 4 counts of arson, which are offences which allegedly have taken place while she's been inside prison. And the most significant thing is that she's apparently been judged mentally fit to plead. That is very significant because we understand, we'll say it is alleged, that Melanie's legal team were unable to get their specialists in to see Melanie. That appears to have been blocked by the prison staff or the prison governor. And indeed, we know from an earlier occasion that social workers who should have been able to see Melanie as a registered disabled lady were also denied access to the prison. This is in breach of the law, Mike. So wherever Melanie Shaw is, it appears that the British government can simply rearrange proceedings to suit themselves. So will she get a fair trial? Well, we wait to see. Hopefully there will be members of the public in that court hearing, and hopefully there will be some good reports following the hearing itself. But as an aside on Melanie, viewers have been particularly unhappy at the way Amnesty International has been refusing or ignoring the Melanie Shaw case. And David Scott tweeted this out, which received a good reception. Has Amnesty UK been bought? British government funding of Amnesty Amnesty refuses to investigate the case of Melanie Shaw. Has the UK government bought immunity? It certainly looks that way. Now, I took the opportunity to speak to Amnesty Media Team earlier today. I'm going to say they were polite but very defensive, and they have promised that if I email in a little bit later this afternoon, they will come back with a formal response on why why Amnesty International does not believe that Melanie Shaw's case is worthy of them reporting or taking action. And I did find it rather sad, I think is probably the correct word, that this is one of the articles on Amnesty International's website. Home Office, stop blocking children's rights. So they're saying that children that have come into the country are not getting the rights they should be entitled to unless they pay money. Can I believe the British government is charging for justice in this way? I can. But of course, it's one thing to say these children unable to get their rights. Compare that to children who simply have all rights taken away as a result of abuse. So hopefully we'll have more to report on the Melanie Shaw case tomorrow.
Censorship on the internet is moving ahead of pace. The headline on CNN Tech here is YouTube, Apple and Facebook remove content from InfoWars and Alex Jones. And as usual, it doesn't matter what you think about Alex Jones or InfoWars. The question is, should this be taking place? And the other question is, what is actually taking place here? But aside from Alex Jones, others have been targeted. Daniel McAdams, the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute, has had his Twitter account suspended. Scott Horton of the Scott Horton Show has had his suspended, and they've also completely removed the Twitter account of Peter Van Buren, who's from antiwar.com. So this is something which is beginning to spread. Now, just briefly speaking about Alex Jones here, in parallel with this, of course, he is facing a defamation lawsuit from some families from Sandy Hook case, where parents who have apparently lost children in that event are taking him to court for claiming that it was a false flag. They're particularly concerned about the language he was using. Sandy Hook is a synthetic, completely fake, with actors, in my view, manufactured, is what he said in 2015. And so he's in parallel facing a legal case over that. Now, of course, that perhaps gives him the opportunity to put whatever evidence he has in front of a jury. Whether there will be a jury, of course, remains to be seen. But look, the bottom line here is this. Facebook and Twitter, Google, and in fact, in the case of Alex Jones and InfoWars, also Apple, and I believe one of the other podcasting platforms as well, removing content, not actually blocking his entire account, but removing content from, in the case of Apple, from iTunes, of course. But this is much broader than that, because this isn't about corporate censorship. If you look at the mainstream media coverage of this, it's all about focusing on the platforms. And again, people are being directed in the wrong direction here, because these platforms are effectively being or they're doing what they have agreed to do. But where did the policy actually come from? Well, it came from Theresa May. Well, in fact, it probably originally came from David Cameron when he was making a speech to the UN General Assembly in 2015. Many people have seen that speech where he described people who were not following the mainstream narrative as extremists, right-wing extremists. And he was saying that, anybody that was skeptical about the mainstream narrative on 9/11 or on 7/7, for example, would fall into this class of right-wing extremists, and he was expecting something to be done about this. Theresa May, then following the London terror attacks, the London Bridge terror attacks, called Google, Facebook and Twitter into number 10, where she had a conversation with them. And then, as this independent article from last year, from September last year, is pointing out, she then followed that up again back at the United Nations, where she was demanding that they develop technology to prevent what she was calling evil material from ever appearing on the web. And she said that she was going to be working with the leaders of France and Italy. Of course, that was the past Italian leadership, different situation now, but she's certainly still working with Macron to progress this, sorry. And of course, we've got to remember the statement that she made at the G7 regarding the rapid response mechanism, that all G7 countries will follow an agreed narrative. Anybody that isn't following that agreed narrative, there would be action taken against them. So Facebook, Microsoft, Google, and Twitter were among the companies that she called into number 10, among the companies that she then has followed up on in other speeches and other pressure that's been put on them. So this is not really about corporate censorship. This is about government censorship, Brian, through the corporations. You know, the publicity that's being built up over this, of course, has one aim, in my opinion, and that is to get people off Facebook in particular. And I've said this a number of times. It's worth saying again. It's because what they're aiming to do is to get back to the early 2000s situation on the internet 1.0, where everybody was in their nice little walled garden, their own little discussion groups and discussion forums, and there was no cross-pollination of ideas. Facebook, being the ubiquitous platform that it is, allows information to spread in a way that we've never seen before, and this is what governments in particular are really pretty determined to see shut down.
Well, I think in response to that, and perhaps we can bring Mark in,
yeah.
I think that this is one of the most dangerous episodes that we've had in UK, because we've got a dictatorial government. We know that the government's working hand in glove with big corporations, whether it does that openly or behind closed doors as well. Now they're bringing in censorship. This is a fascist state establishing itself. It's just that instead of some evil-looking man in a suit, we've got Theresa May with her nice jewellery and smart clothes and handbags and shoes. But this is a dictatorship. It's coming in very quickly. And this, if it's allowed to establish itself, is going to become vicious. Mark, what's your take? You're seeing this happening in America. We've got it happening in UK. That can't be an accident.
Oh, certainly not. One of the things is that in Washington State, there's and across the country in academia in America, free speech, of course, is under attack. And there is a college in Olympia, near Olympia, Washington, in the American Northwest. I believe it's called, I want to say Evergreen College. Forgive me if I'm wrong. We can correct that later. But a biology professor testified to Congress that protesters have been completely shutting down his classes and any free speech on campuses. And when he spoke to Congress, this professor said, I think his name is Brett Weinstein, not to be confused with the Hollywood mogul at all, but he told Congress that he sees the control of speech and the control of discourse completely being swallowed up by these companies that are working on behalf of government, you know, the companies being Facebook, Google, and so on. In other words, kind of the privatization of the First Amendment. And that's what seems to be happening in our world, is the privatization of government. Things that used to be in the hands of the state are now being delegated or shared with corporate entities. And so they're completely reworking the whole governance system so they can say, well, you know, these are private companies. They have a right to control what goes on their mediums. Therefore, the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, for example, does not apply. So we're seeing a reworking of governance, a whole reworking of the relationship between the people and their state, and even a reworking of what the state even is. And this is what's amazing. Inasmuch as they're also cracking down on every little element of speech, I've often believed, and I think there's evidence for this, that whenever somebody is censored for using the N-word about Negroes, about blacks, or they're censored for the homosexual issues, being insensitive and all of this to LGBTQ. I think all of this is just preparation to crack down on ever widening types of speech. You know, if they can stigmatize certain kinds of speech about gays, about blacks, then they can continue to stigmatize other types of speech, social, political, cultural, and so on. So it's a massive stigmatization and a massive privatization of speech.
Mark, I would agree with that. And what came into my mind while you were mentioning those two examples was David Scott, of course, has been talking about this clampdown on free speech, which is coming in Scotland. A Scottish National Party now effectively telling people what they can and can't say, what adjectives they're allowed to use and which ones they're not. This is a carefully orchestrated program, and it's not there for the benefit. So we're sold this be careful with your language on the basis that it protects various groups, some of them very vulnerable groups, but ultimately you can see this is just used as a leverage to produce a clampdown for everybody. I think it's amazingly sinister.
Sticking with Facebook then for a second, of course, Facebook, the other problem, the other mechanism that is being used to drive people off Facebook is this fear over data collection and so on. Of course, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, if you want to use that word, part of this. But this is another one coming up because Facebook has allegedly been asking United States banks to share customer financial information with them. This is with a view to, again, targeting advertising for people that are, interested in certain financial products and whatnot. But at the end of the day, the point I made on yesterday's news program is that this type of data collection by Facebook, it's being used for a particular purpose, which is, targeting advertisements. But when we look at the data collection which is being done by government, by local authorities, by any other public bodies, or any other private corporations that are providing services on behalf of public bodies, we find that actually Facebook is only a part of the picture here, and perhaps we need to be much more concerned about what public sector in collaboration with private bodies are collecting that information and what that's being used for. Because while all this smokescreen is being created about Facebook and Twitter data collection, there's a bigger picture over here which most people are missing.
Yeah. Well, let's change subject slightly, but we've still got the issue of censorship on, where are we? Here we are, sorry. At the weekend, Fresh Start was in Orkney, Kirkwall in Orkney Islands, in order to give a talk about child abuse. I was one of the people who was invited to join in that small conference, and it proved to be an exceptionally interesting trip. This was the venue. I have to say that the Pickaway Centre in Kirkwall was extremely friendly. We'd been given a nice little room. Fairly early on Saturday morning we were there to set up for the presentation. All was going well. I popped out for a few moments. When I came back in the room, I was surprised to see that we had a young constable from Police Scotland who'd popped in. And apparently he'd popped in because some people had contacted Police Scotland because they were unhappy with the idea that the Fresh Start Foundation should be talking about child abuse in Orkney. Now, as is usual with the police, they were very big on telling us that people were unhappy and complaints had been made, but we weren't able to know any details about those complaints or to know anything about the people who had supposedly accused us. Could it have been that the police made that story up themselves? Well, on this occasion, I don't think so, because that young constable was so pleasant. But nevertheless, they were reacting to us there, trying to speak out and warn the wider public what is really happening about the abuse of children, not only in England and Wales, Ireland, but Scotland as well. But the story had another interesting little twist, because we did some leafleting the day before in Kirkwall itself, and we rapidly came across the BBC building. This is BBC Radio Orkney, a really lovely piece of architecture there. We decided to pop in because BBC had been asked about 2 weeks earlier if they could help advertise the Fresh Start conference. We went in, we spoke to a very nice lady who summoned a very nice young reporter, and in no time at all they said they were sorry that they'd sort of missed the original telephone call, but they were very happy to put up an advert for the event on their Facebook page. And this is the poster for the event, and it went up about 2 or 3 hours after we popped into the BBC. That was really excellent. When we checked this posting later in the evening, we were interested to see there were about 9 comments, but unfortunately when you clicked on those comments you couldn't bring up the comments from the public. So that was a little bit puzzling for us, but it got more puzzling because by the next morning, although Orkney Radio still had lots of information on the local agricultural show, plenty on horses, ducks and all things farming, our advert for the Fresh Start talk had actually disappeared. And this was puzzling to us. So we had 2 things. The public comments were censored or blocked, and then our advert gets taken down, but all the rest of the stuff stood. Now, I did speak to Radio Orkney this morning. This was an informal chat, so I'm going to leave names out of it, but I'm going to say that I was told by a gentleman that BBC Orkney Radio does not normally accept adverts, but they can be posted as a guest post or words to that effect. And that the BBC automatically censors comments to ensure that there's nothing to disrupt legal process, for example. But they weren't really too sure why the advert was accepted in the first place, because we should have been told that we could only do it as a guest post. So there was, remarkably, after a phone call 2 weeks ago and a visit the day before the event, a little bit of confusion in the BBC, Mike, but nevertheless, after posting it, the BBC took that advert down, and personally I'm not too sure why they did that. Let's move on to 5G, and just like to say that in Totnes Civic Hall this coming Saturday there's a talk on 5G. Many people deeply concerned about the health issues and risks of this system. One of the speakers is going to be Dr. Graham Downing, and he's also there with Mark Steele, who's already put out quite a lot of information about the dangers of 5G.
Okay, Novichok 2, the sequel, rumbles on, because apparently the UK has now asked the OPCW for an extension of technical assistance following the Amesbury poisoning. So apparently a team of scientists from the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has visited the UK, or is on their way once again following their visit last month to collect samples. These samples perhaps didn't produce the result that was expected, Brian, I'm not sure, but for some reason they need to come back and take more samples. So they're saying that the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons received a request on the 6th of August from the United Kingdom for the OPCW to extend its technical assistance in the technical evaluation of unscheduled chemicals. In response to the request, the OPCW will deploy a technical assistance team to follow up for a follow-up visit and collect additional samples. Samples will be sent to 2 OPCW designated laboratories. Once the results of the analysis are received, the report will be submitted to the United Kingdom. Well, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office said that during their visit, the OPCW experts will collect more samples to inform their work. Following their visit in July, the samples will be analysed at highly reputable international laboratories designated by the OPCW. So, well, I'm not really sure what's going on there, Brian, but they don't seem to be too certain about what actually happened in Amesbury, and they need some additional help.
I don't think I'm at all surprised, Mike, because nothing about the incident stacked up, and as a result we've seen what have we seen? Misinformation, disinformation piling up, and now they've backed themselves into a corner with the OPCW, and they're going to have to work to get some form of sensible answer out.
Right, Mark, let's move over to Donald Trump and your article here in American Free Press. Trump criticised bankers' policies. He's been criticising the Federal Reserve.
Yes, this is a rather unprecedented thing, and it's been, of course, covered up and obscured by all the constant obsession with the Russian meme and all the things that are hitting our heads like a Chinese water torture over the last several months, even the last year or so. And this was about 2 weeks ago where Trump came out And as I wrote here, he's not just hedging on free trade deals to make bold foreign policy strides with North Korea and Russia and things like that, and so on and so forth. He upped the ante even further, and this was July 19th, by speaking out against the Federal Reserve Bank and talking about the fact that the interest rate hikes are going to hurt the economy. And I'm kind of looking at the article here, and what happened was the media, such as Richard Bove of CNBC and many others, of course, jumped to the defense of the Federal Reserve and talked about how the federal government, the Congress, the president, and whatnot ought not and shall not criticize the Fed. There's this unwritten rule that the media reminded Trump about, that thou shalt not criticize the Fed. And the meme, the narrative is always that if Congress has any say about monetary policy, which it actually should have because it's given that power in the Constitution, but if Congress tries to have any say about monetary policy, or if the president tries to have any say, that they're politicizing the Fed. But what it really means is that the Fed does not want any public oversight of its operations. The Federal Open Market Committee meetings that happen on a periodic basis are announced that they're going to happen, but the president, no member of Congress, no member of the press can attend these open market meetings where interest rates are set and where monetary policy is set. This is almost like a Masonic operation, you might say, metaphorically speaking, where the unwashed are not allowed to see how these things are done, how this monetary alchemy is carried out. So you have Trump really on a more practical level, for starters, saying that the Fed should not continually raise interest rates. It's going to make things more expensive for corporations. It's going to make things more expensive for the borrowing of small businesses. Therefore, those small businesses will have a harder time hiring or keeping employees or paying them sufficiently. And Trump's just talking about the practical impact of interest rates and how those costs are passed on to small businesses and those costs are passed on to the end consumer. But even that small criticism of the Fed, as practical and relatively minor as that is, the media attack dogs jump to the Fed's defense. Thou shalt not criticize the Fed. And the Fed is supposed to operate in this secrecy I spoke of with the open market committee meetings. And so the story goes in protecting the central bankers. And this is a textbook case of how this happens. When somebody logically suggests proper oversight or criticism of the central bankers, the media, rather than being objective and looking at both sides and looking at Fed policy a little more skeptically, instead jumps to the Federal Reserve's defense. And I imagine it's much the same with the Bank of England.
It's exactly the same with the Bank of England. Now let's move up to Canada, Mark, and of course another, possibly second only to the banks in terms of how it's protected or how they're protected, are corporations the size of Nestlé, and of course while we're dealing with hosepipe bans, which then are magically revoked just in time for fracking to begin in the north of England. In the United States, we still don't have this situation in this country of huge quantities of water being pulled out of aquifers in order to fill bottles to be sold to the general public for drinking water. So this is from Awakening News, and they're talking about Nestlé taking the groundwater of Michigan. So how much water are they taking? And one of the things that I noticed from this article is how much they're paying for the water that they're taking. And I was interested to compare that with how much they're selling the water for.
Oh, yeah, this is on awakeningnews.ca, for which I'm a consulting editor with John Devine. And I went to a Constitution Party meeting about 3 weeks ago in Michigan, one of the minor parties that's trying to get visible in the United States. And they had a convention where they nominated their candidates, and some of their candidates for governor and lieutenant governor spoke of this issue. And it really piqued my interest because we're looking at Nestle paying $200 a year per permit to withdraw right now 250 gallons per minute. But they've already been approved to withdraw 400 gallons per minute. They're just waiting for the infrastructure to be put in a town called Evart, Michigan, EVART, where there's a huge Great Lakes aquifer. Much of Michigan, of course, is a freshwater paradise, you might say. But they're wanting 400 gallons a minute, which is 576,000 gallons per 24 hours, or 4 million gallons a week, or 16,128,000 gallons per month. And in a year, that's 193.5 million. Over 10 years, that would be nearly 2 billion gallons with a B. And they're wanting that for $200 a year out of the EVART plant. And they've been approved for it. And what's amazing is that when they bottle, when they bottle the water up, they're selling the bottle of water, which is Ice Mountain brand, for anywhere from $1 to $2 a bottle for 12 to 16 ounces. I've done a little preliminary calculation. At first, I came up with a 3,000% markup, but I'm afraid it's much more than that. We're literally chopping a penny into like 10,000ths of a cent. So a bottle of water, the profit is just off the charts. And getting that take on the aquifer for $200 a year is really striking. It's even more striking than what me and the Awakening News found out with some research we did, where Nestlé in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, is getting $3.71 per million liters. But this take in Michigan, the draw on the aquifer is even greater. We're calling it plundering because that's exactly what it is. No other entity would be allowed to withdraw a natural resource for such a dirt cheap price. And it just shows the degree and the egregiousness to which corporations are bending the will of governments and getting their way and are being allowed to shove aside every other consideration in their pursuit of profit. And not that profit itself is wrong, but this is really egregious plundering, where antitrust laws, antitrust principles are just completely failing. And I would add that it's worth mentioning too that this shows how topsy-turvy things are, because what should be happening is that we should be having, if people want fluoridated water or water laced with chemicals that they claim are healthy, they should have to buy it in bottles, specially marked bottles, and knowingly and willfully buy that kind of water. But what happens instead is towns like Flint, Michigan, will completely contaminate the water and cause illness and deaths. And any town, most towns across the states, most municipalities will put fluoride and chlorine in the water, and they'll basically contaminate or at least adulterate the public water. That's the water that should be relatively unadulterated and clean that we get for inexpensive amounts right out of our faucet. Instead, they contaminate or adulterate the water that's available to the public. They allow Nestlé to use reverse osmosis and all these different processes to bottle the clean water for a huge profit. So therefore, the amount of water available to the public is constantly intruded upon by companies like Nestlé, and that hammers the amount down to where we have to pay a premium for the water coming out of our faucets. And then on top of that, the water is chemically treated in the way I mentioned. So the good water is constantly reduced by Nestlé's intake, and therefore we're paying more and more for less and less water for the public access. And then that water that we access is chemicalized or contaminated or adulterated in the way I described. So it's completely reverse of the way it really should be. The public should be getting inexpensive water that's clean. People that want chemically treated water should have to pay for it in bottles, but it's completely reversed.
Mark, I wonder whether I can ask you, and I often ask this question, is there an awakening in the US public over this? Water, of course, a key resource for everybody. Are people beginning to see the scam of water extraction?
Yeah, there were 83,000 comments in the public comment period about a year ago for this Nestlé withdrawal in Evart, Michigan. And of those 83,000 comments, 75 were in favor of Nestlé, and the 83,000 or so were all against it. And the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality still approved the increasing of the intake from 250 gallons a minute to 400 gallons a minute.
Sorry, sorry, Mark. There were 75 in total positive comments towards Nestlé, and the other 83,000 were against this, but the local authorities still pushed this through?
That is correct, and that's confirmed by a state senator out of Ann Arbor. It's pretty egregious, and it's just a complete inversion of how water policy should work. Not to mention fish hatcheries that are drawing something like 1,000 up to 2,000 gallons per minute that are open flow fish hatcheries rather than closed ones, which recycle the water and clean the water. So between fish hatcheries and water bottlers and fracking, our groundwater, especially in an island state like the UK, but across the world, especially in the Western world, our groundwater is seriously being hammered by these corporations being given extreme privileges over the public's, over the public's objections. So this is something I'm continuing to monitor. But I just learned about this recently, and I thought it was bad up in Guelph, Canada, but now I find it's even worse here in Michigan.
Okay, quick advertisement, Mark, for an event coming up in the United States.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, September 8th at Hotel Contessa near the Alamo in San Antonio, Texas. I'm speaking on global cities. Christopher Bolin is speaking on 9/11. Mickey Paletta is speaking on the way that banks and financial institutions and debt collection law firms are using forged documents to proceed with foreclosures on people's homes and businesses. And these are among the hot topics, but the central topic is the USS Liberty and a movie that's being made about that to raise funds for that. That movie is going to show what happened in June of 1967 when, unbeknownst to most people in the world, especially those that mainly watch mainstream media, the Israeli Army, the Israeli Air Force and Navy attacked a U.S. ship that was not on war maneuvers in international waters. That ship called the USS Liberty. And this conference, the main topic will flesh out exactly what happened. It'll raise funds for a movie about the Liberty. It'll raise a little bit of funds for alternative media. And people can go to my blog, thetruthhound.com. That's thetruthhound.com. Or they can go to mixnstream.com. That's MIXN like Nancy, stream.com. Follow the prompts. There'll be a link that says the ship that won't sink, referring to the Liberty. You follow the prompts and scroll down to the main page where it outlines who's going to be there. And you go to the bottom, you'll see an icon that shows the Liberty, and you click on that. And for just $10, you can buy videos, online access to videos of all 6 speakers, including me on Global Cities and the others that I mentioned. And that way, anyone in the world can watch this conference in real time, I understand, but also after the fact. And then also those that live in Texas or near there, relatively near, or those that want to travel can come to San Antonio for a little over $27 and buy a ticket to see the conference in person. But I appreciate you posting that, Mike. And it's going to be a real turning point kind of conference. And we're creating a model by which we can inexpensively put on conferences like this all the time. So this is one of many upcoming conferences under what's called the Great Topics series.
Okay,
so
very
there
good.
You go.
Very good.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Okay, let's move on quickly because, well, it's a real shame, Brian, but the moderate rebels, shall we call them, in the northwest of Syria, in Idlib province, are starting to fight amongst themselves. It's a crying shame. They're starting to feel the pressure because the Syrian army is on its way with Russian help. Well, in the Idlib de-escalation zone, according to Fort Russ here, which includes parts of the provinces of Idlib, Hama and Aleppo, clashes have broken out between radical Islamists and local supporters of reconciliation with the Syrian government. Well, they're talking about individuals that originally left, senior members of the Syrian military that left the Syrian military back in the day and joined the Free Syrian Army, that have now been making efforts to work out how they can avoid a bloodbath in the area in the event of the Syrian army starting to take control of the Idlib province once again, and that these people are then being kidnapped by the Islamists in the area. Don't know what's happened to them. The example given here is a former colonel in the Syrian Arab Army who turned to the Free Syrian Army a few years ago, who's now been kidnapped by Tahrir al-Sham for contacting the Russian forces and the Syrian government on how to proceed with reconciliation. So that's clearly not liked by some of the more extreme moderates there, but they're fighting amongst themselves, crying shame.
Well, or not.
Indeed.
Well, talking of terrorism, of course, that's produced fear in UK. And I just couldn't miss this one, albeit a BBC headline, but Belfast Airport turns away wheelchair users due to repair kit. And what took place here is that gentleman Steve Smithers turned up. He'd got in a plastic, visible plastic bag, a toolkit for his wheelchair. But they said that basically this could be used to dismantle the plane, so they wouldn't allow him to take it through security. They said you can go back and check it on as hold baggage, but unfortunately if you do that, you're going to miss your flight. I read this and it's just unbelievable. Common sense now completely disappeared out of our airport security. One of the things that I've discovered is that if you try and take a violin on board any of the flights, internal, it's a big problem because of course the bow could be used to kill people.
Really?
Yes.
Well, I have to say I've been boycotting Belfast International Airport for a number of years because of the security staff that they have on there. It is an appalling airport. It's a small airport. It's only Belfast. It's not London. People complaining about Heathrow Airport and the security situation there, that there are 2-hour queues to get through Heathrow Airport. Well, Heathrow Airport, one of the biggest airports on the planet, and in the present security situation, you might understand that. Belfast International Airport has no through traffic whatsoever, and it's a relatively small airport, and they also have 2-hour queues to get through security. And so this type of behaviour by Belfast International security staff is unsurprising. They are completely off their heads, in my opinion.
Off their heads. Well, I'll just add this one, that I started my journey up to Orkney via Exeter Airport, and having gone through security and been swabbed down for explosives because one of the scanners didn't seem to like what I was wearing, I then collected my bags and was just walking through the corridor when a gentleman in a suit spoke to me. He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Why do you want to know?" And I then had the most venomous man virtually spitting in my face, because apparently he was a police officer, and when a police officer asks you where you're going, you are required to reply. I looked into the eyes of this man. My opinion is he was heavily reframed, and I would say in the right situation he would be dangerous. I felt intimidated by that man to a certain extent. What other passengers felt would be extremely interesting. So the terrorist create fear campaign going well, and we now see utter madness in our airports.
Mark, we're literally out of time, but I just want to bring this one in because this is regarding city regions. So the Prime Minister has confirmed that a city region deal for Edinburgh and South East Scotland. It's going to create a £600 million boost to jobs and economic growth, and the deal itself is worth over £1 billion. So hundreds of millions of pounds of investment for the southeast of Scotland, formally signed off by the Prime Minister and the First Minister today. Theresa May up glad handing with, sorry, what's Nippy's proper name? I can't remember at the moment. Doesn't matter. The First Minister of Scotland. She's so memorable. So the UK and Scottish governments have each committed £300 million apparently to this city deal, which will see over £1 billion spent investing in unlocking economic growth. But it isn't really about unlocking economic growth, is it, Mark? Because this is really about devolution, big society, power, centralized power to the local level as much as possible, the smart cities agenda and so on. There's so many policy agendas in behind what's being presented as merely a mechanism for improving economic growth.
Yeah, I'll take a closer look at this, but at first blush, it looks like another kind of, corporate-driven, corporate partnership with the government, a scheme to give the, impression of economic growth and kind of consolidate power at the local level, like you're saying, under the guise of economic growth. I don't really think it'll do much for the economy, but it'll certainly devolve and consolidate power at the local level. And it'll be interesting to take a look at what the mechanisms are on this one. I know that there's going to be a lot happening next month in California with global cities and the Global Covenant of Mayors and sanctuary cities and all of that. It's going to pick up in the fall with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, with Jerry Brown leading the charge in California. He's the governor of California. So it's going to be interesting to see how all this fits together. But
well, this is a key point, isn't it, Mark? Because this is a global policy. This isn't just about breaking up the United Kingdom, although that is clearly what Theresa May is doing here. But this is a global policy being implemented here.
Yeah, they want to give this kind of veto power and this sort of mutiny power to the locals, where they don't have to do anything that the national government says. They might partner with them a little bit in getting things going, but to where they create a system that's outside our constitutional order, and they reorder and revamp and reorient everything. It's a tough thing to watch. It's kind of a moving target, but if they really wanted to have economic growth, they'd revamp the monetary system. They'd put more interest-free money created directly without borrowing it from the banks into circulation, and they'd put some consumer purchasing power, some buying power into the economy. And if they really wanted to pick up the economy, that's what they would do, and then everybody would benefit from the top down and the bottom up. But instead, this is a fascism, a marriage of corporate power and government, and a reorientation of power. And the economic part is just a sales job for the most part.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, we just end on an update on Melanie Shaw. While we've been working through the news, more information has come in, and the report is that Melanie looked very confused in court. She was rambling, clearly distressed, and in a very bad way. And the person who sent that information has said, in their opinion, she is not fit. So we're now in a very, very serious situation because, of course, what does the British state expect after putting a sex abuse sufferer, so PTSD victim, in solitary confinement? What would you expect? I think there's something immensely dirty going on here, and there's no better case at the moment to show the world the true state of Britain as a society under Theresa May's Conservative government than the brutal abuse of child abuse whistleblower Melanie Shaw. We'll report more on that tomorrow. Mark, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to everybody who's joined us today, viewers and listeners. And I'll just say I did take the comment that came in that, of course, that agricultural show that was reported on Radio Orkney is a major event, and therefore we would expect big coverage. I fully accept that. The point that I was making was simply the apparent blocking of the Fresh Start conference. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.